What just happened to Patrick? I didn't even get to show him my best bubbles. Oh, I don't like this.
You there. Come through here if you wish to save your friend.
That's what I need to do to help Patrick. I'm coming, Patrick!
My excitement level for Nickelodeon All Star Brawl 2, and by extension my enthusiasm for the series as a whole, has been all over the place. The first game was announced, and I was excited, but noticed that the amount of hype behind the game, putting it in a spot it was never going to hit. I played the game and really liked it at first, but as time went on, I realized I didn't like it as much. On top of that, I also started to learn a bit more about the publisher Game Mill Entertainment, and their less than stellar track record, we'll just say. Then Nickelodeon All Star Brawl 2 was leaked, and I was cautiously optimistic, but then the trailer dropped, and it looked promising. But as more and more updates came out, I don't know, I just wasn't really feeling excited, to where I decided not to buy it. But then the reviews came out and they were glowing, so I caved in, and bought Nickelodeon All Star Brawl 2. And well, although there are issues I have with this game, and I played it on the worst possible platform, I will say that not only is Nickelodeon All Star Brawl 2 what the first game should have been, but it's a damn good game in its own right. But let's talk about it. Hi guys, DPX here, reviewing today Nickelodeon All Star Brawl 2. Now before we get started, you know what to do. Be sure to like this video, subscribe if you're new, hit the bell and leave a comment, or I will put you under mind control. Starting off with the good, I mean, basically, just take the first game and make almost everything better. That's what happened here. The gameplay is very much refined. A lot of people didn't like the gameplay in the first game, but I didn't mind it. However, it had a loop and learning curve that just wasn't very fun, and most matches would end up coming down to spiking your opponent off stage multiple times till they die. But for Nickelodeon All Star Brawl 2, which for the rest of the video I'll be referring to as either Nick Brawl, Nickelodeon, or Nasby 2 for brevity's sake, has a gameplay loop that feels much more enticing for newcomers who don't want to spend hours in the lab. A common complaint I heard about the first game is that it didn't feel that welcoming to casuals, but Nasby 2 certainly is. And in more ways than one. Sure, there is the gameplay, but then there are also items, the slime move, which is this game's version of Final Smashes, and more modes than just basic brawl and arcade mode. We'll get to those later, but what I like is that while it's still welcoming to casuals, it doesn't shaft competitive players. And we can't talk about the gameplay without talking about the characters. Not specifically the rosters, I'll get into that later, but the characters themselves, and how every returning character was rebuilt from the ground up and seemed pretty different from how they were in the first game. But then they got some newcomers like Squidward, Jimmy Neutron, Donatello, and Raphael, who should have honestly been in the first game, and then some characters that feel like deep cuts like El Tigre and Angry Beavers. That's some what the fuck characters like Grandma Gertie. Odd pick, and I'll get into that later, but she's actually a lot of fun. There are more newcomers. I also really like Ember, but what I'm saying is many of these newcomers are pretty fun to play. Not to mention, they all got alternate skins. One of my biggest issues with Nick Brawl 1 was the lack of any alts, and then when they added alts through an update, it was always character, but with a hat now. But in Nasby 2, each character has at least 2 full-on alternate skins, which I feel is a massive step up. In addition to each character having alts, each character now has a slime move. The slime move is basically, like I said earlier, it's the game's version of Final Smashes. This was also something I felt was missing from the first game. Whether or not you play with Final Smashes or, in this case, slime moves, I feel like it's just nice to have in the game. But it's now here, and it gives every character more character, for lack of a better term. I also feel like the overall presentation has improved tremendously, from the UI to the backgrounds and even the character select screen. And the game also has a massive visual overhaul. The visuals you're seeing here might not look that great because I played it on the Switch, and I'll get into that later, but on every other platform other than the Switch, the game has no reason to look as good as it does. But it's not just that, as every character also looks great. Look at the character models from the first game, specifically characters like Danny Phantom or the Avatar characters, or like Ren and Stimpy or Zim, you know? And you realize just by looking at their models that they were never really envisioned to be in 3D, like ever. But in Nick Brawl 2, they got it to work. There's also a great selection of stages, and on top of that, I really like what they do with them. To use Smash terminology, and I'm sorry, but it's really hard to escape, there are normal forms, Omega forms, Battlefield forms, Small Battlefield forms, and Smashville forms, along with sorting them by tourney legal stages. On top of that, there is a lot more content in this game, and by content, that can range from there being more modes to simple little extra stuff. As for modes, arcade mode makes a return, and I think it's pretty neat, if a little basic. But then there's also a boss rush mode. And yes, there are many bosses in Nick Brawl 2 because of the addition of a single player story mode campaign with roguelike elements. The story itself is nothing really to write home about, and I'm not the biggest fan of roguelikes, but regardless, I'm honestly kind of surprised they even bothered with the story mode at all, let alone one as fleshed out as this one, in terms of like, you know, not so much the story itself, but like the mode, if you know what I mean. But there is an actual plot about SpongeBob and Patrick being sucked into a world where other worlds are getting sucked into, and everyone except for SpongeBob are under the mind control of Vlad Plasmius, thus explaining why all franchises are crossing over. And SpongeBob and then more characters you beat, you save them from the mind control, and then they all team up to take down Vlad Plasmius. Not to mention, although certain characters like Hugh Neutron and Powdered Toast Man got cut from the roster, they still appear in the story mode, and so do a bunch of other characters like Miss Puff, Splinter, and more, adding even more characters as cameos. I also gotta mention the fact that there is voice acting in this game, which was sorely lacking from the first game. And not only is it here in Nickelodeon All Star Brawl 2, but there's a lot of it. It really feels like they went above and beyond. In other positives, one strong part of NASB 1, I felt, was actually the music, but even then, only the main theme and harmonic convergence kind of carried the game's soundtrack. But this game even blows that out of the water. The main theme slaps really hard, and there are so many other bangers too. There's the Chum Bucket, Bun Wrestling Ring, Miracle Volcano City, and Harmonic Convergence is a banger again, but those were just the ones that stood out to me personally. And lastly, Nickelodeon All Star Brawl 2 has the charm that I feel like the first game really kinda needed, but it lacked. Every character has super expressive expressions, and there is just a whole lot more personality in Nickelodeon All Star Brawl 2.
How did you get here and not fall under my control? That's not right. I guess you're just a mistake I will have to correct.
Moving on to the mixed, these are things that I don't quite want to put in the good, but also don't quite want to put in the bad, or in this case, issues that I have that are in somewhat of a gray area, sorta. I don't know, let me explain. First off, I like the characters, but I don't feel like any one of them really speaks to me, if you know what I mean. Pretty much any fighting game before launch, I look at a character and go, that's who I'm maining. And maybe it's because I wasn't really following Nickelodeon All Star Brawl 2 leading up to release, so I couldn't really think that way. But there was never really a character that I really gravitated towards. I really like the Angry Beavers, and from what I've heard, I might be the only person to have actually said that. But even looking at the upcoming DLC characters, specifically characters like Zuko and Iroh, I feel like I would drop the Angry Beavers or anyone else on the main roster, if I were to main them, in a heartbeat for one of them. I don't know, I feel like this is an issue that I and only I have, and ultimately it's really not that big of a deal, which is why it's under the mixed. The other thing I'm mixed on, and I'm gonna get flack for this, but roguelikes aren't for me. I can probably count the roguelikes I actually like on one hand, and unfortunately, NASB 2's campaign just isn't for me. It's in mixed because I'm very happy that they even bothered adding a single player story mode and made it so fleshed out, and even going as far as to add roguelike elements, making it challenging, and yeah, I never expected that. But even though I really love what they did with the campaign in many regards, I kind of wish they didn't make it a roguelike because I just don't like roguelikes. Most people seem to love this though, so I am in the minority, but it's just not for me. Moving on to the bad, there are two major issues I have, and one is a little iffy, and I'll explain that as the Switch version. You're probably asking me why I bought it on the Switch, especially since I have many other platforms to play it on. I could have easily bought this game on PS5 or Xbox Series X. Well, first off, this game's audience is, by a wide margin, mostly on the Switch, and on top of that, the Switch version of the first game sold way better than it did on any other platform. Hell, if it wasn't even on the Switch, maybe we'd be considering the first game a bit of a sales bomb. And I also get that the Switch hardware is starting to show its age, but really, I don't see how they couldn't have gotten Nickelodeon All Star Brawl 2 to work well on it. I'm not putting this on the developers. It seemed like they really wanted to make a good game, and a good game anybody with any platform can play. This, I feel, goes on Game Mill Entertainment. It's honestly pathetic that they couldn't even be bothered to properly optimize their game for their biggest install base. And that's not a bullshit statement. The Switch is, without question, this game's biggest install base. And even beyond the poor performance, the Switch version comes with a load of issues. Each match takes way too long to load, the game crashes a lot. When I had my GameCube controller connected and my controls set a certain way, the game would often just default to a different control set. Like, I had to stop using the GameCube controller and use the Pro controller instead. Sometimes my character would just not move. Sometimes two songs play over each other at the same time. Stuff like that I feel like should absolutely not be in the Switch version of this game. Especially when you consider that most people who are gonna play this game were gonna play it on the Switch. I'm not gonna let that affect my verdict of the game though, cause it is one version of a very well-made game, and I was able to enjoy everything else enough. But come on, if your only option is to buy it on the Switch, I guess it will suffice. But if you have literally any other means of playing this game, play it on anything but the Switch, because the Switch version is pathetic. As for my other issue, look, I think Nickelodeon All Star Brawl 2 improves just about everything from the first game, except for the roster. There are just too many choices with the roster. That just had me scratching my head. And I know a lot of people were upset over the fact that there were roster cuts, but really, Smash Ultimate kind of spoiled us and got us used to not having roster cuts. So my issue isn't that the characters got cut. My issue is how many characters got cut, who got cut, and who they added instead. There are a whopping 11 characters from the first game that are absent here, and that is out of 25 characters from the first game, counting DLC. There are some cuts that I'm kind of indifferent about, like Helga, I'm not going to lose sleep over, and Ablina, I mean, that means now there's no Real Monsters rep, but whatever. Then we get into some other weird cuts like Cat Dog, who was a fan favorite from the first game, and Lincoln Loud, specifically because they kept Lucy but not Lincoln. But again, I'm not going to lose sleep over them, but those are a bit more questionable. But then we get to some more questionable ones, like Sandy and Toph, and even Hugh Neutron, considering how he was a fan vote. But then the one that baffles me the most is Leonardo and Michelangelo. Did you guys know that every time the Ninja Turtles appear in a game, it's always all four of them, except for Nickelodeon All Star Brawl? And I honestly feel like if you have any Ninja Turtle in like anything, you gotta have all four of them, at least before you add anyone else from TMNT. But for whatever reason, they just don't want to have all four of them together. And then the characters that were added instead, a lot of them are somewhat questionable. I like the inclusions of Jimmy Neutron and Squidward, as they should have been in the first game. I also think characters like Ember, Angry Beavers, and El Tigre are neat additions that I didn't expect, but other newcomers, I'm not offended by their inclusion, but for one reason or another had me scratching my head. Why did we get Plankton before Mr. Krabs? Why do we have Azula before Zuko? Why did Raphael and Donatello replace Leonardo and Michelangelo? Why do we have 2 characters from Hey Arnold who aren't Arnold before getting Arnold? It kind of feels like they tried a little too hard with characters you wouldn't expect, but ended up glossing over characters that made more sense. Like characters like Zuko, Mr. Krabs, and Arnold should have honestly been in the first game, and I understand 2 of the 3 characters I just named are being added as DLC, but still, I don't hate the roster, but this is the one area where I feel like the first game had it mostly right with room for improvement, but this one kind of regressed in that regard. I know I rambled about the roster, and the Switch version is absolutely pathetic, but Nickelodeon All Star Brawl 2 is way better than it has any right being. This game proves that this team really wants to make a great game to celebrate Nickelodeon and platform fighting games as a whole. They could have just taken the first game and beefed it up, changed the roster, do all that stuff. But they went above and beyond. They drastically improved the presentation, the content, the gameplay, the visuals, and so many things that they did that I didn't even mention, like having, simple little things like there's a jukebox where you can listen to the game's music and you have a character just dancing to the music. Like stuff like that's just not necessary, but it's so cool and just adds to the charm of this game. Nickelodeon All Star Brawl 2 is quite possibly my biggest surprise of the year, as it is everything that the first game should have been, and honestly, more. But as I said at the beginning of the video, not only is Nickelodeon All Star Brawl 2 a major improvement over the first game, but it's a damn good game in its own right. That being said, I'm going to give Nickelodeon All Star Brawl 2 a score, and I'm going to do something I've never done before. Weirdly enough, I think an 8.5 is not quite right for this game. I feel like it's a bit better than that, but I don't quite think it's a 9. So I'm actually going to go in the middle of that. I'm going to give my first, 3/4 score. So Nickelodeon All Star Brawl 2 gets an 8.75, or an 8 3/4 out of 10. That is my review for Nickelodeon All Star Brawl 2. It's a pretty long one, at least the recording's pretty long, so we're gonna wrap it up. What do you guys think of this game? You guys like it, not like it? Anything about the game, let me know down below. Anyways, be sure to like this video, come subscribe, or I will put you under mind control. Bye!